All right. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me um and listening. And let me know if I'm Dawn, can you hear me okay? Is
Yes.
the audio still good? Okay.
Mhm.
I will start sharing my screen. And let me know if you all are able to see this.
Yep. Looks good.
Okay, great. Is it full screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So, this background is a video of my home compost at my parents' here in Atlanta. And I'll just pause this for a second. I just want to give a quick preface before we get started. So, the title of the presentation is Healing Our Soils, Healing Ourselves. And I'm grateful to you all for both being an audience, but also being somewhat guinea pigs because I'm trying to determine the best structure of a presentation that will really tie together a couple different themes that I see as linked through soil, from health and even spiritual healing to utility risk management and economic change. So there are a couple different topics I'll cover today, and they'll be a little bit webbed, so I may jump around a little bit. So at the end, I'm also very keen to receive any feedback about how to make those links clearer, and I'm curious what questions come up for you all, what information you all have that you feel fits into this web of knowledge, so to speak. And we can also make this somewhat conversational. So I'll probably take about 50 minutes. But please feel free to, raise your hand during the presentation if anything is unclear or you'd like to tease out any one topic more, and we can also do some discussion at the end. So, without further ado, I did want to start us off with a passage. I've heard from Dawn that you all are very familiar already with this passage from Gleanings. So I thought one that might be a little bit more salient to this topic is a passage by Abdul Baha, which many of you may already also be familiar with. Um, and since I think we're all on mute but me, I'll just go ahead and read it. It goes, if we should relegate this plot of ground to its natural state, allow it to return to its original condition, it would become a field of thorns and useless weeds. But by cultivation, it will become fertile soil, yielding a harvest. Deprived of cultivation, the mountain slopes would be jungles and forests without fruitful trees. The gardens bring forth fruits and flowers in proportion to the care and tillage bestowed upon them by the gardener. Therefore, it is not intended that the world of humanity should be left to its natural state. It is in need of the education divinely provided for it. The holy heavenly manifestations of God have been the teachers. They are the divine gardeners who transform the jungles of human nature into fruitful orchards and make the thorny places blossom as the rose. The reason I love this passage, there are a number of reasons, but one in particular is that similar to a more succinct sort of imperative that Abdul Baha gives us, we are really all called in some way to be stewards of land, according to our capacity, our rootedness in place, et cetera, et cetera. And there is, I think, a notion that was common in early days of Western modern environmentalism about leaving the wild in its natural state or in a wilderness state. And there's definitely a very good case for having percentages of land or parts of our world left in a wilderness state. But we might over romanticize sometimes. For instance, in the Sierra Club's original language on this, we might over romanticize sort of man as apart from nature. And I think what Abdul Baha really calls us to do is to be both consumers and producers and be involved in the life of our soil and not just allow for whatever weeds grow in a place to grow in a place, but to see what are the webbed relationships of crops and non-edible plants or trees or other species that really increase the health and vitality and biodiversity of a place, and that therefore also increase our own microbial biodiversity and the immunological health of us as a species and as a people. And particularly in this globalized age, when we are more exposed both to toxins and to a higher regional diversity of microbes, I think this becomes particularly salient both for human health and for the way that we look to nature as a teacher in the way of biomimicry, for instance. So one other quote that, again, I'm sure you all are all familiar with: the more microscopic animals that exist in the soil, the better the plants will grow. And a quick personal aside, because I think it's related to the topic of healing. Part of the reason I feel strongly about that word and this title is that soil, in many ways, also brought me to the Baha'i faith. I had known about the faith from age 13 when I met a good friend of mine whose family is Baha'i. But I didn't become a Baha'i until 2023 when I went to Haifa, in part to learn about drip irrigation in Israel, but also at the request of this good friend of mine who taught me the faith to join her family for 3 days of pilgrimage. And it really, I see sort of my own spiritual path as very aligned with a calling of regenerating soil. I do feel this is, I feel grateful that this is both my career and really a spiritual calling of sorts. Um, and I believe that as more people get involved in soil stewardship, we will all start to see the spiritual significance that working with soil can have in our lives, and in our embodied health, our, not only our spiritual beings, but our physical beings. So, um, to start us off, I want to share that, when we talk about climate change, and climate change will be a big part of this presentation, we think of a very dire picture. But I think that soil really gives us a hopeful alternative. We know that soil is indispensable. We know that roughly 75% of our arable land has been degraded, or eroded or desertified to some degree. And it's very difficult to estimate this. The estimates range, but we're looking at roughly half of topsoil lost from the dawn of the original agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago. So we've got this, we've lost a lot of topsoil and mineral material to sediment loss, erosion, et cetera. But we also have this, therefore, upward capacity in rebuilding topsoil that could do a lot to both sequester carbon and increase the productivity of our arable land on Earth. And if you've read any books like Dirt by David Montgomery or Collapse by Jared Diamond, there are a couple others that talk about this. We know that the erosion of soil and deforestation as kind of a precursor to that really are is kind of the common variable that we see in the fall of civilizations. And it is very much still a risk that it could precipitate the fall of our global civilization. But as Baha'is, I believe we're quite hopeful, and I am quite hopeful. And I do think that soil can be, both from an economic standpoint, a climate standpoint, um, a human health standpoint, it can be a portal to our evolution and our blossoming as a people, and also to the integration of us as a species, where we really do see that diversity breeds resilience and a shared capacity that we can cultivate together. So, a couple of topics we'll cover, some in a little more depth than others, but this is kind of an overview of what I'd like to talk about: is soil not just as a carbon sequestration medium. So we think of soil as a medium that we can use to pull carbon or excess CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that can be a climate change solution. But more than that, I want to really demonstrate the argument and the science for why soil can help us regulate climate patterns through water sequestration, because I think that's a part of the climate conversation we really neglect to our peril. A second point that we'll cover briefly is how soil can help us transition to a more circular economy model as opposed to a linear and extractive one. I'll talk briefly about how soil restoration in particular can help us heal and reconcile societal wounds, particularly in the US, by rearranging a more caste system like economic hierarchy into a more webbed and flat ecosystem of reciprocity and mutualist work. And I also want to talk about how soil can teach us the value of being producers and engaging in physical labor, and all of us seeing the value of physical labor as noble work in our own lives. And then lastly, the more spiritual part of this dialogue is how soil can really bring us closer to God, and make us more embodied, feeling, and constantly healing beings. So I'll start with my story, if that's all right. I really first was ignited by this calling, as I'll call it, when I was around 14, 15. I saw this film called Home, which thanks to ChatGPT, I was able to find 10 years later. It's on YouTube. It's free to watch, and it's a beautiful film. And it was really a compilation of aerial images, drone footage of different natural and degraded ecosystems. And I learned about how marshes filter our water and how water is extracted and then channeled to urban centers and particularly dry regions. Um, and the thing that really stuck with me, and it was almost a visceral reaction, was this scene from Madagascar where deforestation has led to the migration of farmers, and also to these deep wounds in earth. And when we look at erosion pictures, there's something, the reason I say visceral is because just like soil is the skin of the earth and it's what forms out, the our encasing in our bodies, the tissue in our physical bodies, um, the way that soil looks when it is eroded and degraded really visually mimics wounds in human skin. And there is a real parallel, I think, in healing erosion ditches and other forms of, gullies, areas where subsoil is exposed and there is no ground cover. There are a lot of parallels between the healing of land and the healing of social fabric and of human bodies. Um, so I had this sort of in my mind. I knew this was something I wanted to do with my life. But I was in school still. I was still in high school and I had college ahead of me. And I later, after college, worked in Los Angeles, where I worked for a guy, or a man called Peter Diamandis, who was very involved in early commercial space ventures, also in biotechnology companies. And my role was as a liaison between startups and investors, or executives who were interested in essentially identifying intellectual property that would be of value to their companies, in the rapidly emerging technological space. And at this point, I would say I'd also drifted farther from spirituality as well, or my relationship with God. And by the end of the job, I think while it had been an incredible opportunity, it also really um, left me somewhat jaded about the way that our economic systems are structured and the way that um, financing frameworks don't allow us to solve problems in ways that are integrated with other problems. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. But for the purpose of this story, a year before I quit my job in California, my former employer, Peter's company, one of his companies, the X Prize Foundation, which does these incentive prize competitions around global grand challenges, received a $100 million donation from Elon Musk, for carbon removal uh, projects. So essentially, they put up this $100 million prize fund and they invited teams from around the world to compete to develop technologies, and other solutions that were able to sequester carbon dioxide from air, from the atmosphere, and store them in a stable form for approximately 100 years. I may be getting those metrics wrong, but essentially, it became a light bulb moment for me because I knew I wanted to work in land regeneration, but I wasn't really sure how to build a business around that because of the profit models that exist. And knowing that there is a growing carbon market was sort of a door to for me to think, okay, well, maybe this is one way I can build a business around regenerating soil if I look at the carbon sequestration potential of soil. But knew I still am I still have a lot to learn. But at the time, I definitely had a lot more to learn. And when I started out learning about climate change and the carbon equation, um, it became clear pretty quickly that much of our climate change conversation focuses on carbon, but it's a very incomplete picture. We sort of have this idea that if we reduce CO2 emissions and if we magically could snap our fingers and tomorrow just stop emitting carbon dioxide, we would reduce this greenhouse gas effect. Especially if we could then sequester carbon, and we would see a reduction in heating. And that's not really the case. Particularly when we look at carbon capture and storage methods that just take carbon and they drill them down underground, store them in bedrock or in other commodities even. Um, One, we're not really acknowledging that carbon is a resource that can birth biological life, but we're also ignoring the fact that water is a big part of this equation too. And I'll get to water in a second. But just quickly, I think it's important to cover the numbers. This is an early chart I did to just help myself understand the loss of carbon, both from dead fossil carbon, which we see in our fossil fuel emissions. Things to make cement or power our cars, et cetera, but then also the loss of carbon from soil. And if you look at the breakdown of carbon stores, we see that oceans form the biggest sink by far. But then we see that soils really can store about 3 times plus the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere, which is, again, a reason I thought, okay, soil is a great solution as far as carbon removal is concerned, because in theory, if we were to regenerate half of the soil that we've lost, we could sequester all of the excess carbon dioxide that's been emitted post-industrial revolution. And in theory, that is, that seems true. But the equation is obviously a lot more complex than that. Um, and another stat that I want to share with you all that adds to this conversation is that when we look at carbon projects, a lot of them will focus on planting monocultures of trees and growing forests. And while growing forests is important, when you look at the carbon on average across the terrestrial biosphere, so across forests, grasslands, silvipastoral land, any land type, only 19% is in trees and plants. About 77% of all carbon in the terrestrial biosphere is underground in soils, root systems, et cetera. And even this is an image that was actually drawn out I believe in the 1930s when the Soil Conservation Service went to the Great Plains. They brought in these huge haulers. They dug out a 40-foot deep test slice of soil and they put a glass panel against root systems. They brought in all these fire trucks. They hosed down these root systems. And then they had scientists trace out the root systems against this glass panel and found that there are plants that grow maybe 2 feet tall, and yet their root systems can extend 15, 20, sometimes 25 or even 30 feet deep. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it just goes to show that there is this underground carbon storage and growth potential that we often ignore. And that's very difficult to measure, which is part of why the market doesn't want to measure it, since it's not as reliable for, let's say, a financing company to predictably measure and say, we can stamp that we've sequestered this many gigatons of carbon underground in this test slice, because it's just not, we don't have the tools to do this kind of measurement. So I started asking, how do we, one, restore soil at scale, to solve these, multiple problems that soil is at the intersection of, but also how do we get private industry to invest in this? One model that I like to think of is that the best solutions are those that use multiple problems to address each other. And I'm going to give a particular example of that in just a second. But with soil, for instance, we've got a lot of problems, all of which can actually be can neutralize each other through the restoration of soil. So, for example, we have extreme floods on the one hand currently. We also have groundwater decline. So, the aquifers that are underground that are fed by those root systems that we looked at in this picture. Let's see, here it is. Sorry. Um, the aquifers that get fed by root systems and through soil pores, those have declined dramatically. And yet, soil is the very medium that could take that flood water and percolate it down to groundwater if we restored soil such that it had those pores and those root systems and holes. So that's one example of where two problems can be used to cancel each other out. And there are many others that we can talk about, but just to stay on this same thread, because I was in California at the time, I started talking to farmers and I started trying to understand what can be done about soil loss and soil degradation, who is addressing these issues, and basically which types of soils are the ones being invested in. Of course, most of the time when we hear about soil regeneration, we're really thinking of agricultural land. We're thinking about farms that have maybe jumped on the regenerative agriculture bandwagon. They've recognized that these, the synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides that we use are compromising or even destroying long-term sustainability of land. And then you'll see maybe farmers over time transitioning to regenerative agriculture. However, there's not really a market for regenerating non-agricultural soils. So we might think of utility soils, we could think of industrial soils, we might think of brownfield sites. Anytime you drive down the road in a semi-urban area and you see mediums with these patches of turf lawn that are direly undercared for, those are also soils that could be regenerated and be made into these rich sponges that could absorb stormwater and percolate it down to groundwater, or absorb carbon and help reduce microclimate temperatures. But we don't have a marketplace that funds that work because it's not profitable. So, when I started talking to farmers, I started looking at all of the concurrent problems that exist in California. So we've got drought, wildfires, floods. There's something even called the arc storm, which is it's like a 1 in 200 year storm. And in this picture that you've just seen pop up, the Central Valley, as I can't remember which author talks about this, it might be in Cadillac Desert, but essentially the Central Valley has been and can be an inland sea. In 1844, there was a storm that flooded most of the Central Valley. Sacramento, I believe, was pretty much underwater. There were people boating through the streets, and we're predicted to have another arc storm in the next 10 to 15 years. We also see heat waves, too little water for irrigation, so groundwater loss, and farmers no longer being able to irrigate their fields because they're no longer able to get permits because the aquifers have depleted so much. We see the incursion of salt water, which also is very difficult for crops to grow in. And then also land subsidence. So this picture here was taken by a scientist, and I'm forgetting his name, so I'll find it at the end of the presentation. But he went and essentially did measurements at 30-year intervals, or I guess 30 and then 20, to look at how much land was sinking in some of these heavily irrigated areas where groundwater was being pumped from aquifers. And there are 30-foot drops in land levels at in some parts of the Central Valley at, at the greatest depth of land subsidence. And so part of what we can even do in areas where you don't have contained aquifers is use soil to filter and sponge up and filter water down to aquifers to regain some of the land loss. That's not possible everywhere because of the structure of different aquifers, but it's something that that can be protected against through soil regeneration. So these are just examples of problems that soil can be a solution for. So I already mentioned this question. My obsession became, for the first year of starting TeRenova, how do you get private industry or the capitalists to invest in this? We have all these problems. We know soil can solve many of them, but who is actually going to be the one footing the bill? And how do we get people who have the money and the land to see that this is a solution and invest in it? So I met a woman called Carolyn Finney in the Bay Area. And she was not a farmer. She was actually a clinical psychologist. But one day she went to a meeting at the sanitary district near San Francisco. And I'm going to check our time because I might even just play her video. In fact, because of time, I'll tell the story quickly. Essentially, she found out from this wastewater treatment facility. It's one of the biggest in California. They process a lot of municipal wastewater. They use a very energy intensive industrial process to clean that water, and they then discharge about 50 to 200 million gallons of perfectly good recycled wastewater per day. And she found out that instead of using that water, they were just throwing it into the Suisun Bay. So it was, taking perfectly good recycled wastewater that could be used for irrigation and putting it into a saltwater environment and losing it to the sea. And she said, well, this is a sin. And how can we possibly use this water? Um, and so she talked to one of the board members of the sanitary district who said, well, actually, we have 1,500 acres of buffer land around this sanitary district. And she said, well, let's take 15 acres even and see if we can develop a farm. And they fought her for the longest time, minus this one board member who was in her corner, because they didn't want volunteers in industrial zoned land. They didn't, they were like, this is not what our sanitary district is for. Um, but she persevered, and one of the fights that they put up to her was they argued that because she had mulch on her land, that she was a fire hazard, that this wood could be lit by fire if there were a wildfire, and therefore it would be a risk. So she said, okay, well, we'll do some tests. But before she even was able to do her tests, there was a highway road collision that sparked a fire that started burning all the grasses around this sanitary district. And it reached the border of her farm and it turned away. None of her farm, her 15 acres, was burned. She had put down 2 feet of manure, a foot of mulch, and because of how moist the soil was, it just totally avoided the fire. So when she told me this story, it kind of clicked as far as my question of how do you get private industry to invest in this, that PG&E, California's big electric utility, pays in the billions in fire victims trust payments whenever one of their pieces of rusted equipment catches fire and it lights up all of the foliage under the power lines. And typically, firefighters spend the first 30 minutes fighting or evacuating neighborhoods around these utility easements. And so by the time they actually get to fighting the fire has pretty much has spread to unmanageable degrees. So in 2019, after the Camp Fire and the Dixie Fire, PG&E actually filed for bankruptcy, but because they're owned by PG&E Corporation, they were bailed out. And they faced, I believe, around $1 billion in lawsuit charges. And then, in addition to that, they began a process of liquidating PG&E stock to pay $30 billion in fire victims trust payments. And so they are still nowhere near paying those out. But it seemed intuitive to me that if you were to regenerate soil under power lines, and invest, a fraction of what they're paying after the fact to do damage control, or post damage recovery, that they could preventatively work on this problem and restore soil at the same time. And so this has sort of been the one of the key pieces that led me to build the business model that I'm now working on and doing proposals for pilot projects about. But one stat I also want to share with you all, and this brings us to our conversation about water, is that every 1% increase in soil organic matter yields up to 25,000 gallons of soil water per acre. So when you think about putting compost on soil or putting manure on soil or anything that is increasing your soil organic matter and ideally your microbial life, you see a sponge effect where the land has a much higher carrying capacity for stormwater. And then if you add to that good root systems, that stormwater can percolate downwards and then be accessible to plants when they need to sweat in really hot conditions. So this might not be, it might not be a silver bullet for preventing wildfires, but it might reduce the spread and the rate of spread of fires when they do occur. It also brought me to another example that I learned about from a woman, Dima Asaf, when I was in Jordan. I did a year after I left LA because I could no longer, I no longer had my salary for my previous job. So I sold my furniture and my car and moved out of my apartment and did a year of soil and soul searching. And in the course of that, as I mentioned, I went to Israel and to Haifa, and afterwards I went to Jordan and I met a woman, Dima Asaf, who I was originally attracted to because of a quote that I heard from her called, "It is not drought that causes bare ground, it is bare ground that causes drought." And she had a similar story to Carolyn Finney's, where they had developed she had been part of a project to develop a Miyawaki forest strip, which is essentially a very intensive it's a way of accelerating forest succession in a very thin strip of land. And we can talk about that after the presentation if you all have questions, because it's a fascinating method. But just for the purposes of the story, there were these two really rich soil and forest strips that were about 3 meters wide. So you can imagine kind of a thin corridor of forest, and a pretty sizable neighborhood fire had made its way through a city in Jordan. It had jumped over a 10-meter wide highway somehow, and it reached this strip of Miyawaki forest, and the fire just stopped. And it essentially this strip of forest was a fire break, even though it was a forest. So even our understanding of fire breaks can shift when we really consider the soil more. So I want to use a good bit of time to talk about water and soil. As I mentioned, we oftentimes think about soil as a carbon or as a climate solution from the standpoint of sequestering carbon. But what we are increasingly learning through a number of very recent studies is that soil can actually cool microclimates through water regulation more than it even does through carbon regulation. And I'll come back to this slide, but just to give a visual, this is an illustration that I've wanted to turn into, I filmed it while drawing it, and I'd love to turn it into a video, but I'll try to do a kind of baby version of that right now, which is that when you look at deep root systems or soil that is highly porous, that it has a lot of pores, that has a high percentage of soil organic matter, not only do you see absorption of water, but you also see, and I'll see if I can get my cursor here. Um, I'm gonna actually, uh-oh, sorry, I'm trying to see if I can uh, show you all with my cursor. Um, what you'll notice in a richer soil that has deep root systems, water is much more basically the plant root systems can reach further down and even access shallow groundwater. And when plants can access shallow groundwater, what happens when they are under high levels of heat is that instead of soil radiating heat back into the atmosphere, plants have a higher capacity to sweat. So you get very different heat transfer conditions under bare soil conditions versus rich soil, rich vegetation, deep root conditions. And a study that was done, I believe in 2021 in Spain, found that when you have very dry or barren soil, what you end up getting when you have a heat wave or very hot conditions is this sensible heat flux effect. The soil will actually heat up faster than the air above it. And because hot air can store more water than cold air, it will suck any remaining moisture out of that land that it can, which then makes the land even more brittle. And then any foliage that is growing on that land becomes incredible fire kindling. So fires ravage these areas, and you've seen this in Portugal. You've seen this in Texas when Xcel Energy was liable for the recent fire that happened there. You see this in California. You see this. You saw this actually even another case of a utility, Hawaiian Electric, in the Hawaii fires. This is very common whenever you have bare soil, a heat wave. You'll get this sensible heat flux effect, and you almost see like a mirage. And you can actually, I think this is a video. You get this mirage effect, which is literally heat that's being radiated off of land that heats up faster than the air above it. However, when you have wet conditions, when you have deeper root structures that can access groundwater, when you have higher organic matter content such that water can be sponged up more effectively, you get a latent heat flux effect, which is the opposite effect. So it takes about 540 gram or calories of heat energy to convert a gram of water into vapor. So basically doing the phase change from liquid to gas. And what happens when land takes that 540 calories of heat energy to convert the gram into water vapor is that that heat essentially will some of it will go and radiate back up to space, some of it will stay in the atmosphere, but essentially it will cool the immediate air above the ground. And so you actually get a microclimate cooling effect in if you have, let's say, a large piece of land that's highly moist. So it just goes to show that water is much more responsible for our local heat dynamics or our thermal dynamics than we talk about in the climate change conversation. And one scientist whose talk I would highly recommend watching is a guy called Walter Janae. And his estimate is that water is responsible for up to 95% of global heat dynamics. I'm sure there are other scientists that would disagree or put it at a lower percentage, but still, most would say that water and water vapor are responsible for a large percentage of heat dynamics, more than carbon. Another effect you get because oceans have absorbed so much of the carbon we've emitted, even if we were to sequester atmospheric CO2 at high rates, you would still get this reequilibration effect where as we draw down carbon from the atmosphere, the oceans will then just emit a lot of the excess carbon they've absorbed. And it would take, like 400 years for the atmosphere to be kind of this like conduit for carbon back into land. So we really need to be thinking about water cycles as much as or more than we're thinking about carbon. And I will skip this slide. So just to recap, because I know that was a lot of information. There's sort of this virtuous cycle that I think of where if you increase soil organic matter, you get more porosity in your soil, you get literal, like tubes in your land. You get because of those pores, you have more air, which allows for more aerobic microorganisms and worms to funnel through that soil. You then get healthier roots, which can extend a lot deeper, which then increase your soil horizon. And then those feed the microorganisms that allow you to then have porous soil. And so it's this virtuous cycle of increasing soil pores, which then increases your water absorbing capacity, which also then increases your biomass capacity and your biodiversity. And so instead of just focusing on carbon, you now have this engine that pulls carbon and water down and creates this rich life basically. And so we really have this capacity now as a globe to do land regeneration projects at scale and see a much faster rate of biomass growth. One, because of the higher carbon levels, but also because we have a lot of waste inputs that can be used as soil amendments. So I want to make one note also about root depth. We talked a little bit about that Great Plains diagram where you saw all those deep roots. And there's a woman, Dr. Elaine Ingham, whose course I've been taking online. She's an unbelievable spokesperson and scientist. She's really in my view, responsible for um, catalyzing the increase of microorganism research. A lot of the soil scientists in the 70s that she was learning from when she was doing her doctoral work. Essentially said that the microorganisms had no role. That soil is really about the minerals, the chemistry, and everything that we put in our plants needs to come from fertilizers that are introduced externally. And she took an interest in the microorganisms and has done a number of studies and projects since. But one thing I want to share about root depths is that even when you look up um, crops, let's say that you're growing, or native species, and you want to know what their root depths are, I've learned from her to really take a lot of those estimates with a grain of salt because oftentimes the what we measure in root depth is limited by the compaction of land. And so there are many species whose root depths or root depth capacities we really don't know. They might have a much higher genetic capacity to put down roots than the land is allowing them to. And so, just as a point of example, she did an experiment with a number of graduate students many years ago in, I believe, Washington State, where they looked at trees. Oops, I already gave you the punchline. Sorry. They looked at trees that were about 200 feet above an underground cave. And there were these roots that were kind of scraggling off of, or kind of coming through the roof of the cave that was under this forest. And she was curious to know if those roots were living root systems. So she thought, well, why don't we do an experiment where we inject dyes into the tree barks of these trees, and then we'll go to the cave and we'll see how long it takes, if it even happens, for that dye to come down into the cave. And so at the same time, all of these grad students injected these trees and they were going to go get a lunch afterwards because they thought, well, this is going to take a couple weeks maybe, or maybe a couple days. And we've got time before we need to go to the cave. But within about 3 minutes, she got a call from the people that were in the cave. And they said, you all need to come down right now. We've already seen some of the blue dye come through. So it just goes to show that in some cases, when the soil allows for it to happen and when the plants have had enough time to grow healthy root systems, in this case, active roots reached a depth of over 250 feet. But a lot of the problem with, or a lot of the reason we don't see roots reach their maximum genetic capacity is because of the imposed compaction in our cities and our agricultural fields. So this is again why soil is so important. I'm going to skip through some of these slides because I believe I've made my point as far as water. This is just a little bit of footage from the Central Valley in California after the floods in 2023, where I was trying to essentially show that you can see me very adamantly trying to if I turned on the audio, you would hear it sounds like basically like a rock. So you had this incredible opportunity with all these floods, and yet most farmland was too compacted for water to even percolate inward. So this is kind of to give a sense of the worst case scenario as far as compaction is concerned. And so then what you end up seeing is fields that flood, but they don't actually absorb water, and that water either evaporates or it runs off the field and it carries the soil with it. And this is a picture of fields that were just left to flood in California, also in 2023. So I'm going to skip ahead here. This is essentially the same point I made before. And I will show you one picture here, just as far as how soil is restored, which is what I'll talk about next. One thing I have started doing is a method called soil pores. So in this is actually this picture on the right here is in my parents' backyard where we there's a little clearing of land where different weeds and ferns are growing. And essentially, what I've done is taken our home compost. My father helped me use a post hole digger to dig out these basically pores of soil about a foot deep. And then we just filled them in with really rich, humusy compost. And I've done an experiment with a couple other soil amendments too, like biochar. There are a couple soil companies that I've purchased from just to see how different mycorrhizal species, uh, combinations of compost and biochar can work to rapidly regenerate soil laterally. So the idea is if you have this kind of hole in your or this pore in your land, you fill it with a soil amendment, that those worms and microbes, if they have enough to eat, they will start to move laterally through your soil. So you might be able to accelerate the regeneration of topsoil in a given piece of land. Um, and this speaks to the many ways we can regenerate soil. I won't spend too much time on this slide because I also want us to have time for Q&A. But there are many methods, as you all know, given that you all are the agriculture working group, I think I might be preaching to the choir here. But I'll just talk about the few methods of regenerating soil that are less spoken about in agriculture, particularly on land where you aren't necessarily growing crops for consumption. So one, I already mentioned wastewater, but there are forms of recycled wastewater that are irrigation grade. There are also phytoremediation plants like lavender, sunflowers. There are actually a whole host of species, and we're still discovering more that are able to extract heavy metals from soil, that are able to remediate brown sites. Perennial species, as you all probably know, are highly effective also because they provide year-round ground cover and better water absorption. Mycelium, we could do a whole other talk on mycelium, so I'll just name it. But then there are also these really interesting landscaping methods. So permaculture, I'm sure you all have heard of, cover crops, we've got vermiculture. Here, tiered agriculture is fantastic also just because it slows the descent of water and helps increase groundwater and groundwater availability. And then water harvesting methods. So there's a guy, Brad Lancaster, whose land I believe this is, and he's in Arizona and does a lot of water catchment landscaping to essentially use the natural contours of land and pockets of vegetation to hold water and allow it to seep in, even when you have really barren landscapes or very little rain. And I believe he's gotten to some points in some of his experiments where he doesn't need to use irrigation at all. Um, Another great example, there's a wonderful movie also on YouTube that you can watch by a guy called John D. Liu about restoring the Loess Plateau in China. It was this area that had been farmed, hundreds of years ago. But as agriculture became more intensive, it became highly eroded, and you started to see, because of the sediment runoff in big storms, you started to see the Yellow River flood to the point where villages would be swept out by mud, essentially, that would just wash up on the shores and cake the whole town in mud. And so it became a huge economic loss. And so the Chinese government financed a large scale remediation project where I don't know how many people, but many, many people were involved in applying soil amendments and check dams and other tiering mechanisms to bioterrace and restore this Loess Plateau such that it became a sponge of water, not a slide for water. And so it's a great example where, when you have either an economy or a government that facilitates projects at scale, they can be highly effective. But it also speaks to the problem that I'm trying to work on through my company, which is that when you don't have mechanisms of scaling large scale land regeneration, um, because the economics just don't work out because no one can profit from it enough to invest in it in the short term, you really miss out on these opportunities to do really incredible work that can restore the fertility of huge swaths of land. So this brings me to the economic part of this presentation, where I am working on I've got a working paper, but also I'm really trying to build a case for how soil can restore um, or can transform economies into more circular models. So this is excuse the very kind of back of a note style of this diagram, but I essentially tried to show in very simplistic terms the food supply chain as it currently exists, which is indebting us and also resulting in a very inefficient use of resources that really hemorrhages capital across, along the way. So we have, at the production side, we've got our farmer that typically, grow now in large monocultures using all sorts of top-down inputs. You then see that food move to a processor. You've got the packager, the distributor, the retailer, the maybe the food service provider, whether that's a restaurant or a grocer. And then you've got the consumer. And then on the other side, once the consumer is no longer, has thrown away their food waste, that food waste then gets basically transported through a similarly long and circuitous waste supply chain that ends up in a landfill and emits methane. But when we look at the soil food web, for example, we see a much more webbed approach to resource management that doesn't waste anything. And this is where I think soil can both help transform. If we learn from soil and the way that soil food webs work, we can try to mimic economic cycles such that they become more sustainable, more zero waste, more circular and webbed in nature, and far more efficient. But also, by restoring soil, we are actually required to do our work differently. And what I mean by that is that currently about 80% of farmland is in the hands of about uh, I don't know what the exact statistic is. Some will say in 1% of 80% of farmland is owned by about 1% of landholders. But it really depends on how you break up those farms. The point, though, is that um, most land is in the hands of the few. And when there are large corporate landholders that dictate how that land is farmed, you tend not to get the stewardship and care that you would get if you had more owners of smaller acreage sites. And so one of the arguments that I'm trying to make for why land can give us an example of where efficient economics meets the demands of justice is that if we have more equitable land redistribution, we start to see more webbed approaches to land management, where maybe a community or a community of farmers start to use local inputs and waste inputs like compost or manure or green manure from crop residue, for instance, to regenerate land in ways that doesn't rely on these top-down corporate provided chemical fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, etc. And then you also see a more webbed relationship between the different stakeholders in your food chain. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it gets into another topic, but we can talk a little bit maybe about it in the Q&A section, because essentially there's an argument about soil and circular economy models. The way I'm trying to do this in practice through a couple pilot projects is under utility lines. So I mentioned PG&E, or other utilities that might have a vested interest in regenerating soil under power lines from a extreme weather risk management perspective. One way you could do this under power lines is to start to build a social ecosystem of stakeholders that can provide all the inputs necessary to restore that land. So you might have a wastewater recycling plant that could provide irrigation water. You might have farmers that have cattle that could graze that land in a rotational way to restore the soil health through manure. But those farmers tend to be on much smaller acres than is healthy for that cattle. So there's kind of one man's trash is another treasure equation going on. You might have compost producers. You could have biochar producers from the timber industry. Essentially, you have a lot of stakeholders, particularly in rural areas, that have all of the waste inputs necessary to serve as very healthy soil amendments. You just need labor and you just need someone to finance it. So I'm kind of trying to figure out a model that will convince a utility to invest in that labor and then also involve people and farmers in a way that is equitable, that pays well, and that can also help revitalize the farming industry since we're seeing so many leave agriculture in the last 10, 15, 30 years. Last thing I want to talk about is soil as a teacher and healer. And I'm just going to also check our time. Yeah, we really need to wrap up. Um, in fact, I'm going to skip this slide. I'll give two examples that we can end on. One is on soil and immunological health. So there was a study done in 2020 in Finland where a daycare wanted to see if forest soils would improve the immunological health of their children. So they transplanted about 20 centimeters of topsoil. Or a 20 centimeter deep layer of topsoil that would cover their daycare floor or their kind of outdoor barren playground area from a natural forest nearby. And they had children play for about an hour and a half every day in the soil. And even on the first day, teachers reported that children were almost in awe of the rapidly transformed forest floor in the backyard, and they just ran out and started doing all these activities in the soil. So there's almost like a natural desire to play in the dirt that we aren't really giving a pathway to in young children. And over 28 days, they took blood samples and then skin and gut microbiome measurements from these children. And they found across all immune health markers that they measured an improvement in proteins that help with immune response, the TGF. So I think that's transformation growth factor beta 1. I can't remember what the T stands for, but essentially, a lot of immune markers that demonstrate or that are indicators of the body's capacity to fight off disease improved relative to a control group of children in other urban daycares that did not do the experiment or who just had a lot of hardscape. And we see this also just, as far as consumption of foods that are grown in regenerative capacity because of the microbes that are in that soil. The other example I want to give is from a book called Earthing. It's a book I can't actually claim to have read. My mother read it and has recommended it to me, but I found this example in it where there was a diabetic, and this is one of many anecdotal data points. There are only the beginnings of larger research studies being done, but there was a diabetic woman about 84 years old, I think 84 years old at the time, who had an open wound that was caused by a blister that had not healed for 8 months. And so every day for I believe 2 or 3 weeks, they did a grounding electrode patch session for 30 minutes a day with her. So they put these patches that were connected to ground conductivity outside through a grounding outlet. And within a week, you'll see in B, the wound started to close up and she was barely limping anymore. And then at 2 weeks, she reported no more pain and the wound had pretty much entirely healed. So we see even from an electrical conductivity standpoint, there are many who will refute this, but personally, in my soul searching journey, I have found grounding to be a very healing practice and a very nervous system regulating practice. And so it's just another example of how soil can be healing. I can give another example about an antidepressant compound that's found in compost, but I want to leave us enough time for Q&A, so I will stop sharing my screen. I really appreciate you all listening. I hope I didn't jump around too much, but I'd love to talk for the remainder of our time and just hear what you all, yeah, have to share any questions.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Claire. I'm just going to change things back here a little bit for recording purposes. Um, yeah, gosh, so much to think about there. And it's so impressive. Right now, we have a reading group that's studying water. They're
Oh, neat.
reading, and so we're seeing these connections between soil, and there's so much. You can't talk about soil without talking about water also. It's
Mm-hmm.
really, really fascinating. And you touched on so many points there. Um, does anyone have a question or a comment? Just raise your hand if you could. Any questions? Helga.
This is just a little question for Harvey Gardner. Based on the root systems you researched, if I weed in the garden, is it better to just cut the weed off instead of pulling it out by the root? That,
Hmm.
that's one of my questions. And the other is really these humongous forest fires that we had in Canada and places. Um, do these kind of ground restoration, would that help?
Yeah, both are great questions. The one I would ask a question to you about your weeds, because there's a common debate now about how weeds are just anything that you don't want growing or anything that's that's different from what you're trying to grow. And so what I might yeah, so I'm curious if they are weeds that get in the way of important if they're hurting your land.
Not much. I mean, I have a jungle out back there in these 30 by 30 feet backyard. Um, but there were some things that little plants that look like clover, but they have toxic milk sap,
Uh-huh.
the name. Um, then I have comfrey, and I just cut that
Mm.
back and use it as compost. It's really good compost. But sometimes it takes over. It just spreads a whole lot and too much.
Right, right. Um, this is where actually, Helga, you have more experiential knowledge than I do. So I want to say that first, because to take what I say with a grain of salt, I'm not as much an agronomist. But what I would say is that if you put certain maybe if you apply compost in the areas where you want a higher succession plant than a weed, you might end up getting fewer weeds because one thing that we didn't cover in the presentation, but that I can try to synthesize quickly is that when you look at soil succession, at the very lowest point where you typically have weeds growing, you have a high proliferation of bacteria and very little fungi. So you might be at a ratio of 100 to 1 bacteria to fungi. As you begin to increase your fungal to bacterial ratio, the the plants that grow are no longer like weeds just start to get outcompeted by your higher order or your higher succession crops. And so that's where a soil amendment that's biocomplete. I would look up, I'll write it in the chat. I would look up biocomplete soil amendments by Dr. Elaine Ingham because she gives a prescription for making compost that involves forest leaves. So if you use a lot of browns from a forest that has a lot of lichens and mosses and higher succession plants, and you start to put those in your compost, you'll start to get higher succession basically a higher fungi to bacteria ratio. And then a lot of the weeds that might have been a concern probably will be outcompeted by other plants. So it might be one way of resolving your challenge. And then also looking at perennials that are very hardy that might outcompete them could be helpful too. And then second question, briefly, it's hard with a forest to do soil regeneration because you don't really want to put compost on an old growth remnant forest floor. We don't know, we've barely scratched the surface of fungal species and microorganisms that live in old growth forests. And so trying to take microbes from food waste and putting them on that soil can actually maybe do more harm than good. What I would say could help with wildfires is to target the soils at the locations where wildfires typically start. And that's why I'm very interested in electric utilities, because they tend to be the ones liable for wildfires. They usually, there are these large swaths of land that have been shaved, and you have more rusted equipment. You've got electrical equipment that can light woody material on fire. So I think the solution is less putting compost or soil amendments in forests and more identifying the really high risk land where wildfires start so that you can really stymie fires at their root.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire and Helga. There are a couple of questions in the chat here. One of them is from, let's see, Jahan asks, our challenge is compacted clay soil that does not drain well. What suggestions do you have for that? Well, I could just say, and you know this too, being from around Atlanta, that red clay soil, organic matter.
Yeah. No, Dawn, I would say the same. Oh, go ahead.
It's the answer to everything. If you have sandy soil, you need organic matter. If you have clay soil, you need organic matter. Yeah. Anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think you said it all. The one thing I might add is doing planting ground cover that's really good at breaking up compaction. So one example are forage radishes are fantastic for basically find plants that have whose root systems have a higher pounds per square inch capacity to puncture soil. There are also some native species. I'm not sure, Jahan, where you are, but I would look up native species that are very hardy in clay soil that are good for compaction that have deep roots. One non-invasive, non-native species in anywhere other than Southeast Asia that is very good for this is vetiver, and I'll put vetiver and I'll put forage radishes in the chat. Vetiver I've used and I need to do a little bit more with it, but it has root systems that clump and they can go down 16 feet deep. And if you put them with a good soil amendment, they'll start to break up your compaction and puncture. Basically, they'll serve as like the little taxi cabs for the microbes that will do more soil structure work. They'll serve as taxi cabs for those microbes to get deeper into your soil horizon, and it might just accelerate the process of working organic matter into your soil. Because I think we can talk about organic matter as helping with compaction, but there needs to be a way to actually work it into ground effectively, which is why I've done the post hole digger method of creating these kind of soil pores that are like little cups in your ground. But there are other ways to do it. And I think having good cover crops that can bound that organic matter so it doesn't move and run off will help as well.
Great. Okay. So let's see. There's another comment in here. It says using grazing ruminants like goats will help alleviate fire risks. So someone asked about fires.
Oh yeah, and Karen, thank you for saying that because it's something actually that a couple utilities are now doing is they're contracting goat ranchers to do rotational grazing, and it's a fantastic method. Um, yeah.
So, Winnie?
Yes, Claire, this is genius. This presentation is just wonderful. And therefore, the comment I'm going to make makes me very unhappy. But I've had experience close up with people I love doing things under power lines. And both of them, one is my sister, who knew that there was research about leukemia in racehorses under power lines, and she wouldn't give up her little wonderful place to live. And she did die of leukemia. And then my friend Richard, that I was working with, his heart gave out because he couldn't resist planting the corn under the power line. So my question would be, as you pursue this, because I think it's a wonderful plan and economically could be very viable, is to see if there are ways to protect people working under there. And I think some of these methods that your mother is interested in, like the electrical, bioelectrical remedies, there may be some information in that field. I don't know if you've already researched this, but, and I did have a friend who's a pilot who has to fly over the Arctic, and the rays there are extremely strong, a different kind of ray, but he was looking for some magnetic solution. So let me just say this with great trepidation, because I think the idea is perfect. And just if we can protect the people who have to carry it out.
Yeah. No, Winnie, I'm really thank you for saying that. And it also comes from a place of care, and it is something that I wish I had a better answer to. And it's part of the reason I have my own reservations about how this could be done. I have looked into plants that have known abilities to absorb non-ionizing radiation. So there are some species, there's very limited research on this, as you can imagine, but there are a couple species that have been found to kind of like neutralize, or not neutralize, but absorb and buffer against this kind of radiation. But I actually, a neighbor of my parents told me also about, cows having slightly lower body weights when they graze under power lines. And even if you were only to use rotational grazing in animals, which could be another method, then their health is compromised too. So there needs to, I wish I had a better answer, but I'm really grateful you bring it up, because I would love to I'd love to look into it more and see if there are ways, or maybe a magnetic related solution that could help buffer against these health consequences. Because the last thing you want is to do something that's, for health, but actually hurts people.
Thank you.
And I saw a question from John regarding the pattern of tree root system mirroring the above ground branch system. Is this species specific? That's a fascinating question. John, I don't know if you're able to talk about that more. I don't know much about this, but I'd love to know if there's anything you can share about it, because I'm curious. I'm curious.
Okay, well, that's something that I've told a lot of people regarding my job, because I'm a building inspector. So tree roots can be very, detrimental to foundations. And the way I learned that, if you have a tree that's growing over a house, branches, you're gonna mostly you'll have tree roots that are gonna mirror that and go underneath the foundation. But I just wanted to know if anybody knew what percentage of that, or I'm not, you know, I would just like to know because there's so many different types of trees, you
Mm.
know, and but you have tree roots that go under houses all the time looking for water because it's that's where the moisture is underneath the house because it's protected from the sun. So you're always having tree roots travel underneath houses, extracting maybe like 500 gallons a day. I mean, they can extract an incredible amount of water underneath houses and cause all kinds of damage to the house, as a result. So that's where my question was coming from with that.
Yeah. No, and I'm very curious about your work because it's another, I think, economic argument that can be made about healthy soils and ground stability is for the development and construction industries. So I don't have an answer for you. I wish I did. The only thing I can share is that as I've been learning more about invasive species, which I don't really love as a term, but that's what they're called, is that you've got some trees that have running roots that are more shallow. So there are definitely, I guess that would be the one thing I would think of off the top of my head is that there have to be a good subset of trees who don't have similar patterns underground because of their running and root sprouting systems. But I'll write this down because I want to learn too. I'll see what maybe we can all or those of us who are interested can do some Googling.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Rose had some comments in the chat. She said she wasn't able to be on because her children turned on because her children are being loud. So she's muted, but she had some questions about, she said, appreciated that you pointed out that there are all the actors and ingredients to regenerate and build healthy soil in cities, but it's about figuring out how these actors work together. From an industry perspective, what are your thoughts about a systematic way to work together to find soil solutions, academic, industry, farmers, policymakers? And then also just another side question about what do we do about growing landfill sites and how will affect our future soils?
Rose, I love these questions so much. And I think the first one, yeah, it's really what I'm trying to learn. I think there's a lot of, not only does it help us to have these kind of multi-stakeholder collaborative structures of work, but I actually think the work can't happen unless we have a collaborative approach. So, for example, one of the things I mentioned being a big hurdle for any of these projects to get off the ground is the labor gap. We just have too few farmers and too few land stewards for too much land, in part because through the Get Bigger, Get Out movement, we've squeezed that industry so much. And I think we've also lost a respect for the value of physically laboring on land and even if it's a part-time thing that we do, being involved in land stewardship. So one way that I think we can bridge that labor gap is through volunteer work and through research work. And I've seen it done in a lot of places. There's a guy who is a retired UGA professor near Athens who has a wildlife sanctuary, and he's worked with hordes of students from UGA doing volunteer work on the power lines on his land, on this wildlife sanctuary, where they've done a lot of pulling of invasive species, planting of things like milkweed for the monarch butterflies, other native species and perennials. And it can be a great on-ramp, particularly for people and young people who want to learn how to farm or want to learn how to be land stewards, to gain training and also provide care for the land. So I think that's where academia can be involved, is through research questions that require research students, or I guess grad students, to do field work. And then as far as farmers are concerned, I'd say that particularly for farmers that have held on to cattle through the get bigger, get out movement, but that don't have a lot of land and have had to grow their livestock count, there's also an opportunity for them, maybe not under power lines, but on other industrial sites where there's just idle land, or land that needs to be restored, or land that has a lot of erosion gullies, etc. So yes, I think this, I love the way you phrase the question. And so hopefully I can screenshot this chat before we all jump off. But the second question, actually, someone recently told me this week that we've got about 5 years left of landfill capacity in the US. So it's a really, really critical problem. I've seen some of the innovative solutions I've seen. One is that there's a company called Ramo, and in fact, I believe maybe it was even a Baha'i who was on this call who introduced me to someone who introduced me to Ramo. And they are a company out of Canada that they use willow trees to build these kind of thick willow, yeah, like corridors of willow trees around landfills. And willows are really good at remediating toxins. So they'll stabilize the toxins, remove them, sometimes even break them down, so that they kind of detoxify a lot of the waste that is leaching out of the water that runs through landfills. So there are interesting solutions. I think what is going to be a very exciting frontier in the next 50 years is material science developments that use, whether it's plastics or other waste materials in landfills, to kind of create watered down or liquefied materials that you could even use for things like 3D printing. There are people that are very much at the beginning stages of repurposing trash, but I don't think enough work has been done, obviously. So yeah, willow trees is all I got for that question, but I love the question. And I see Helga's, does the power line issue also occur amongst solar panels? There are practices to graze under solar panels. I don't know if you mean, as far as radiation, that's a really good question. I'm sure there probably is some exposure, just because the power whatever you're transporting from the solar panels would have to be transported somehow. So I imagine it's probably at a slightly lesser degree, or to a lesser degree, also a problem. I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of solar panels, not period. I think rooftop solar is fantastic, and if you can have microgrids, that's great. But I find it unfortunate when you have prime farmland be clear cut to put solar panels down. There are some mixed uses of solar panels where they're kind of higher off the ground, so you don't actually have to cut or mow the land. But yeah, I don't think that, I doubt it's perfect.
May I say something here about that?
Please.
The way we tested what was happening with the power lines over my sister's land is I took a fluorescent bulb, one of those long fluorescents, and walked out from her house toward the power line, straight toward it, not parallel, but straight toward it. And as I got closer and closer, the bulb began to glow in my hand. So that might be a way to also test under solar panels, because I don't know what they emit. But if you're in the direct line of, as my son's house was, when I got alarmed about all this issue, his house, because the power lines came directly toward him and beside him, somehow that energy didn't leap off, if that's the way you can explain it.
Huh. So the angle that you approach the power line affected how much?
Yes, yeah.
Ah,
That coming at it, what would you say? Not parallel, but straight at it, like at a right angle. Would that be horizontal? I'm not sure.
perpendicular, maybe.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And it was shocking how quickly, how soon to her little house those power lines were, which were in a field beyond her.
There's also only the high tension power lines, not your average street
Right.
power lines. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. I just also wanted to say that this, although we're sharing knowledge, there's a lot of people on this thread that could really collaborate on the issue about trees. And I know, Claire, you've been doing that already, but the question of tree roots and so on, and all the other things that you're working on, like we've had, if you go back into the YouTube videos, we had, I think she was from Australia. Dawn will perhaps remember it. We had an economist on who was talking about business. And so I'll just add that and get off.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're thinking of Jenna Nichols. Yeah. So, yeah, so there is one more comment here. Karin says, I really appreciate your mention of the importance of water and its role in carbon capture. Too often we focus on the carbon part of the equation and completely ignore the water part. She said more thoughts on that if there's time. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, trying to think there's a lot to cover. There is one thing I'll share, just because it might be a resource that folks would find interesting. There's a guy, Zach Weiss, I'll write his name in the chat, and he started a course called Water Stories. He was studying from other water practitioners like Rajendra Singh in India, and I'm forgetting the name of the first one he learned from. But anyway, he helps through his course, he helps practitioners learn how to build water bodies on land that help slow the descent of water, particularly on hillsides, and just helps us learn how to test land to see where it makes the most sense to put in ponds, or retention, small retention ponds, for instance, where you might have more kind of like loamy soils that will absorb water and then extend it outward in wet periods, and then allow for more water retention during drier periods. So I'd recommend looking at his body of content. There are beautiful illustrations also in his course. It's not a free course if you wanted to take the whole course, but I believe there are free videos of his online. The other thing about water, though, is that we as far as dealing with the water scarcity problem, there's a lot we can do to clean water if we simply use if we look at marshes. I mean, there's so many natural water filtration ecosystem types and soils, and even microbes that that we can try to propagate or use to filter water in brownfield sites or sites where you do have toxicity or let's say lead in soils. So it's kind of like the combination, using the flood water that we're getting in combination with phytoremediant plants and microbes that are really good at filtering that water is great. And then maybe, to your point, Winnie, and I'm so sorry I keep blabbering on. Winnie, you mentioned something about us, many people being in this group being able to collaborate with each other. And I think that's what I've loved about ABS working groups is that we really do have the potential, even if we are in different locations, to help each other carry out projects in our own communities or neighborhoods. And one thing that personally I would like to do more that we could all do wherever we are is look at the stormwater drainage infrastructure near us. So where do you see little channels of water in your neighborhood, or where are there maybe it's at the bottom of a parking lot. Most parking lots will have some sort of drainage system at their lowest elevation point that will empty out into a median or some sort of patch of soil or maybe a patch of forest. And I bet if you took water samples, and in a lot of major cities, there are programs that allow you to sample and test water for relatively cheap. We could do citizen science experiments where we see, how many heavy metals are in this water? Are there hydrocarbon residues in this water? Is there PFAS in the water? And are there plants that we can plant at the closest vegetation point where that water drains? Are there plants that we can plant that are effective at remediating those toxins? Sunflowers is a great one. They're very hardy. They're pretty. Lavender, if you're in a drier region, is fantastic because it's not only beautiful and it removes cadmium and lead from soil, but it's also fragrant. There are plants that can make our environments prettier that also serve a very that are a utility provider too.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think we're coming to the end here, and we so appreciate you being here and just really impressive presentation. Thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for listening, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye. Aloha.
Bye.